Hello everyone, Dr. Dilmar here. Welcome to week 2 of American Government. As we get started on our lecture video today, I wanted to just bring to your attention that we are in week 2 and I'm so incredibly happy that everybody is getting their work turned in. Continue to do that. I see a really just positive response rate from each of you, either doing your work or letting me know that you're working on it. And now's the time to really get that strong footing underneath you, because week 2 does signify, once we get to the end of week 2, the halfway mark for our course. And like I said in the beginning, it moves very quickly. And so one of the things that separates people success versus not being successful in classes such as this is really working with intentionality. So keep a calendar, plan with purpose. When are you going to work on your schoolwork every day? Don't just let it happen through happenstance or chance, like I'll just get to it when I get to it, because I think there's an old adage that says, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So let's plan with some purpose. So I really encourage you to, as you move into week 2, to get organized or stay organized. And you know what? If you feel like you're organized already, it's not a bad time to reflect and then refine and adjust your practices. And I say that just because I know we want to get into the content, but more importantly, I want you to be successful. And I think that this will help you to build some successful practices. So let's get started with our content this week. Last week, as you recall probably in the video, I mentioned about how many people vote in our elections, whether they're local elections, so think about your city or your town, think about the state elections, and then obviously the national elections like for president. And so this matters because the number of people, the percentage of people voting, if it's only 10, 15, 30%, whatever it might be, then those people are voting for representatives who then represent the entire population. And so those people who are voting, their insights, their perspectives, their viewpoints are driving those representatives who then represent an entirety of a population. And so we're going to dig into how those representatives actually represent us in this video. But before we do, I want to invite you to pause this video, and I'd like you to do just a quick Google search. You can find this information pretty readily available, either through like nonprofits. A lot of times they'll have websites where they publish information about elections and percentages of people who vote. So either nonprofits, government institutions, it's usually on all kind of websites. I want you to just pause and look up the percentage of people typically, and okay, you could drill it down to a specific election, or you can look at the trends. Usually this information is posted for several elections in a row. And then maybe the average is given to you. I want you to just look at the general percentage of people who vote typically in your local election, so city or village or town, and then look at the state numbers, and then look at the last couple of presidential elections. So what percentage of people are typically voting? I'm going to invite you to pause and look up that information. And I would actually like you to jot that down, either on your computer, on a little Word document, or on a sheet of paper. I'd like you to write that down. And I'll give you a second to pause. Okay, so as you come off of pause, so you're playing again, you have these numbers in front of you. And what we're going to look at today is a question that kind of seems easy on the surface, but it's actually one of the honestly most important questions in American government, is how do elected officials actually represent us? Because we often assume that representatives simply act on the behalf of the people. Like you might make the assumption, like I would, if I vote for a person, I assume that I'm voting for a person that's aligned to my thinking, and then they're going to navigate their voting decisions the way I would. So they're there in lieu of me or the whole population. But obviously we know that there's a lot of disparity between the way people think and also in how politicians operate. And so there's different approaches or models of representation. So understanding these models will help you to understand why politicians vote the way that they do. change over here, and I'll move my face down so it's not too awkward. So before we look at those models, just think about why it matters. So for example, not just understanding political decisions, but also in the influencing of who you vote for, because this might matter in who you vote for if you understand how they represent you once they're in office. Alrighty. Well, that went too far. All right, there we go. All right, so the delegate model. So the first model is the delegate model, and this is the one that probably most of us, as just a layperson, would just assume is the model. This is where the delegate, the person you voted for, is a direct voice of the people. I think this way, we think this way, therefore the person we vote for should operate and vote based on our preferences. So you don't see much misalignment, and when you do, it's pretty contentious because people do not want this politician voting for things that they would not vote for. So you're voting for them to literally be a delegate. You're saying, this is what I would do, now go do it when these votes come up. So that's the delegate model, focused on voter preferences. So they're voting, and they're voting the way that you, the person who elected them, would think or feel or see things. The trustee model is a little different. So the trustee model is really what it implies here. So it's in contrast to the delegate model. And basically this trustee who you and others have voted for, they're making decisions based on what they believe, and what they believe is in the best long-term interest of the general public. I think this group of people that I represent would benefit from me voting on XYZ in a certain way, and therefore this is how I'm going to navigate the situation. They don't really ask you what you think. They don't, not saying that they don't care, because obviously they do, but they don't necessarily trust what you're saying. They are telling you you should trust them, and it could go against public opinion. And sometimes that leads to negative outcomes, just depending on how you perceive things. So in this model, the representative is trusted to lead and not to follow those opinions of the voters. An example here to contrast is a representative might support a policy that's unpopular because they believe that it will benefit the country or the constituents, whereas with the delegate model, even if they believe this is not the right decision, then they would vote for something because their people are telling them that that's what they should do. So I want to give you another pause moment, and let me go to my next slide here. So I'm going to show you a Venn diagram. If you're not familiar with Venn diagrams, it's basically two circles. And I'm going to keep working on the interactivity here, but we'll give it a try this week. But essentially, I want you to think about the circle. And this blue circle here under delegate would represent all the characteristics of the delegate model of representation. And then I want you to look at the pink and think about all the characteristics that would represent a trustee model. And then what we do in a Venn diagram is where the two circles overlap, we find the similarity. And in this case, there's going to be one main similarity. So this is actually something that you're going to actually write down, so you can type it out on the computer, or you can write this on paper. I want you to pause and give yourself however many minutes you need. You're pausing the video, so you can take as long as you need. And I want you to write down what we just spoke about with the delegate and the trustee model, the characteristics on either side, and where there's overlap. You may even want to pause and rewind this video and look at those characteristics. So I'll give you a minute to pause. Okay, as you come off of pause, make sure you've written down those answers. You can see that 2 traits is recommended for each section. I mean, I would assume you at least wrote down 2. If you could come up with 3, that's great. And then what's the one similarity? This is going to come up on your lecture activity for the week. To that note, I did want to mention, just while I'm speaking about the lecture activity and the questions you have to answer, I did want to mention that last week I had the video and then you had a different click to click on for the questions. I'm going to try to integrate these two together so that when you click this week, you'll see the lecture, and then that's immediately embedded where you have the questions. It just makes one less click for you. So I'll work to have that happen this week. So if you see a difference in that, that's why. Just trying to reduce the clicks, not trying to trick you. All right, so did you come up with these answers? And I'll move my face down. I want you to go back where you typed the answer or where you wrote the answer, and I want you to make sure that you captured these responses, particularly the similarity. So both of these models, in both of these models, both of the representatives represent the constituents. The constituents are the people that they represent and who have voted for them. And they represent and make policy decisions. So they're making decisions, they're voting in both models. And just give you a minute to make sure you capture that. Okay. Gave you a moment to do that. All right. Now, there's a couple of more models we want to look at, but these are an extension of those first two. The first two is really where I wanted to put the emphasis on. So there's what's called a Politico model. The Politico model is essentially a combination of delegate and trustee, okay? So just think about the two that we just did a little bit of work on, and this Politico model is a hybrid. So the representatives really shift between the two just depending on the issue, the atmosphere, the level of public attention, right? If that makes sense, it's situational. And then we have the partisan model. This is the one that's a little bit more, I don't want to qualify it and lead your opinion on this, but I want you to just think about the pros and cons of a partisan model and partisan politics, where we have Republicans versus Democrats, and then you have people who are independent. So I want you to really pause and reflect on partisan politics as we discuss this model. You might even want to pause and do a little quick Google search on partisan politics and see what you come up with, and see what kind of opinions are out there. And in this model, it's pretty straightforward. They follow their party platform. So if you're a Republican, you follow the Republican agenda. If you're a Democrat, you follow the Democratic agenda. If you're an independent, you probably have some kind of hybrid. But this is really about strong party loyalty. But I want to connect this to the real world. So one of the key questions, remember last week we spoke a lot about real world activities, and you guys did an amazing job. Let me just tell you, so incredible. The amount of detail and emphasis and logic like that you used in doing your lecture activity questions last week was very strong. I hope that that continues on throughout the rest of the class. So as we extend on that kind of real world application, I want you to think about, should representatives follow public opinion or should they lead public opinion? So I'm going to repeat that because I want you to think about it, and this will be one of the questions that you answer today, which is, should representatives follow public opinion or should they lead it? Should they lead us, direct us, guide us in our public opinion? Or should it be the opposite way? If you feel safe and comfortable, in having this conversation with someone that you're partners with, or your spouse, or, a parent, somebody close to you that you would feel safe having this type of conversation without it getting too heated, because as we know, some conversations go that direction, maybe ask what their opinion is as well. There's no easy answer. This is just what makes this democratic system complex. Remember, we're not using the word democratic like the party of Democrats. We're talking about our democracy. And we reviewed that last week, what a democracy is. So hopefully you remember that. Maybe that'll be one of the other activity questions for today is, what is a democracy? What does that mean? So if you don't remember, go back and look at that. As you recall, I suggested you having key terms in like a handwritten folder or maybe an electronic version of a folder, because the vocabulary, the academic terminology, that's really the key to understanding a lot of these concepts, is knowing that base information, not about memorizing it, but having it handy so you can navigate these complex conversations. So you really need to remember, what is a democracy? As you see here, the last bullet point says tension is a natural part of the democracy. So it's really not supposed to be conflict like in a negative way, like, conflict. Is conflict in the sense of opposing opinions, and you can have productive conversation and discourse without it just necessarily being an angry situation. It's just that natural tension of different opinions, and that's really the base of a democracy. So go back and look up the actual academic definition of democracy, either from your notes from last week or the video from last week, or even your McGraw-Hill online textbook. So in closing, I just want you to think about public approval of Congress is often very low. However, the re-election rates for members of Congress are quite high. So people get re-elected even though our opinions of them tend to be low. So this is why I wanted you to look up like local, state and federal election results, for you to think, what percentage of people are voting for these folks? Are the people who's dissatisfied voting? And if they are, why do they continue to re-elect their own representatives who they just said they don't like? Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? So again, who's voting? How many people are voting? Are these the people that are dissatisfied? If you're dissatisfied and you're voting, then why do you keep voting for the same people? It's really a question for you to think about. And one explanation is that many representatives behave at delegates at that local level. They might make you perceive that they're a delegate in the sense of that representative model that we spoke about earlier. Remember, what's a delegate model? Right, they speak for you. And they align in your values, but they might behave that way when they're speaking to their constituents or running for election, and maybe people don't go back and look and see how they're actually voting. But then when they get to Congress or they get into those election situations, then maybe they struggle to maintain that approach. And again, this is not about saying there's one way a person should represent you. I'm just giving you the models and posing some questions for reflection. So I'm not saying there should be one way that a person behaves or acts as a representative. These are just the different models. This is the reality, and this is the academic terminology, and this is a place for you to consider what you think. Understanding these models does give us a clear lens for behavior in evaluating leadership in government. Well, hopefully that helped you extend and have some real world connections for the week. We'll continue to dig into those connections in our questions, our video questions that will follow. And if you need anything, just let me know. Have a great rest of the day.